Welcome to this afternoon's webinar hosted by ourselves, UKAA and Grace Hill. Today we're looking at the results of a survey that seems to have been a fair number of months in the making, looking at renters' experience of COVID-19 and their reactions to it, their experience of management and their future decision making. I'm joined today by John Falco, Melissa Palmer and Katie Jeffirs from Grace Hill, who conducted the survey. You'll have heard me referring to Kingsley Associates very frequently. That's both a historic name and a brand that John and Katie work for within the Grace Hill Group. We're also joined today by Stephanie Smith from Invesco and Kevin Watson from Platform, both, I'm sure, well known to almost everybody on the call, and if not, they'll soon be well known to you. Both of whose companies took part in the survey. So, John, without further ado, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate that. As Dave mentioned, we are Grace Hill. Grace Hill provides a number of products to the multifamily industry and has a history in the US and more recently in the UK as well. In addition to the surveys product, which Grace Hill purchased Kingsley Associates in 2020, so we became part of the Grace Hill team. They also do a number of other services for the industry, and that includes online policy management, online training, mystery shopping, and so on. So earlier in the year, or actually last year, we created a partnership with UKAA, and one of our first efforts together was to put together the resident sentiment survey that we'll be discussing today. Melissa Palmer is our team member who works closely with the UKAA on that partnership. And Katie Jeffirs is our team leader for the project management group here and was the manager of this entire survey program. And we'll be presenting the results as we walk through today and with the help from Stephanie and Kevin, as Dave mentioned. Katie?
Yeah, thank you, John. Thank you, Dave. So this project was many months in the making. Just as a little background, we had conducted a similar study in the US, with the US audience, in May of 2020. And as the pandemic continued to rage across the world, we wanted to initiate a similar effort with the UK resident group. So in the fall of 2020, we invited UKAA member firms to participate. The survey was actually launched in January and February. We created firm-specific links for each firm to distribute to their resident base on their own. So the data collection period was January and February. A total of 10 firms participated, representing quite a different range of management firms and units under management from anywhere from 100 to over 4,000. And then over 1,000 residents participated in the study. So before we dive into the actual results, let's first take a look at who participated in this study. We did ask directly what the living situation was of the residents. So a little over half of residents said they rent from a private landlord. And this is a private landlord, but still renting and experiencing professional management because all the firms were UKAA member firms. And then 47% said they rent from rent in a purpose-built community of some kind, whether single-family homes or a multi-unit building. And then there was a number of different household types represented in the study. Here we're seeing that breakout between the institutional landlord, or BTR, and private landlord. And we'll see some breakdowns like this throughout the deck. We do specify where the results are broken out between these groups. So I'll be sure to mention and point that out as we go through the results today. But only about 20% of residents said they are living alone. Most live with someone else in their household. And specifically looking at this light blue bar, 61% of residents live with either their spouse and partner or spouse, partner, and children. So again, we're looking at a lot of different household types represented throughout the study. In terms of age groups, it's a little bit different. Most residents, about 74%, are in the kind of lower age brackets, 44 and under. And then in terms of income, about 42% of residents' household income is £50,000 per year or less. So again, this is household income. So the majority of residents did come from Greater London, and we identified that by asking the residents to share their postal code. And so that's how we identified those groups. But over a quarter of respondents did come from regions outside London, including the East of England and the Northwest. And so naturally, we wanted to ask about a lot of different topics in this survey because the pandemic impacted so many aspects of resident life. There was a lot of things, a lot of topics to cover. So as we go through, we'll really understand the full picture of the resident experience, from employment status, impact on their financial situation, how they felt about management at their community, what their future plans are for renting, and then how they feel about virtual tours. So we'll cover all those different topics today, starting with employment status. Obviously, really important to kind of lay the groundwork to understand what was happening in people's lives before the pandemic and then how that changed. So prior to March 1st, 75% of residents reported being employed full-time, 4% reported being employed part-time, and 3% unemployed. So the vast majority were working full-time. We asked if the employment status changed after March 1st, and 22% of respondents said yes, it had. And then this is how it had changed for that group of 22 respondents. So a little under half had a new job, but 27% said they were furloughed and 15% said they were laid off. And then when we asked what their current employment status was, 59% said they were employed full-time. So quite a drop from prior to the pandemic when we saw 75% employed full-time, 16 percentage point drop. And then naturally an increase in those saying that they were unemployed. So 12% saying unemployed as of the time of the survey. It's a 9 percentage point increase from prior to the pandemic. And then 11% saying they were employed part-time. So naturally, we can assume that this would impact most individuals or households' financial situation. And we asked just very directly if they were impacted financially by the pandemic. So 42% said yes, their household experienced an income loss due to COVID-19. And of that group, we asked to rate the level of impact that income loss had on their financial situation. And 25% of that group said that loss was major or devastating. And then we're looking at that breakdown between these two questions across the different income groups that we saw in the previous slide. So for those in the lowest income group making less than £25,000 per year as a household, 59% of that group said they experienced an income loss, and 55% then of that 59% said that loss was major or devastating. So again, the next natural question becomes, well, how did this impact ability to pay rent? So that's what we're looking at on this slide. Again, we took the approach of asking just very direct questions of the respondents. So the first question is, then, have you received any benefits from the various programs to support unemployment and furlough? And 22% of residents said yes, they had received those benefits. And then of that group, we asked, do you plan on using those benefits to pay rent? And the vast majority, 77%, said, yes, I've used this money to pay rent. A small percentage said that they plan to use the money to pay rent. So we can see that the unemployment benefits were effective in helping to alleviate that type of financial hardship. And then we asked just very generally from April through December 2020, generally describe your ability to pay rent. And the vast majority, 93%, said they've generally been able to pay rent in full each month. 2% said they've been able to pay it in part. 2% said they've been mostly unable to pay rent. And then 3%, not shown on the slide, said they were unsure about their ability to pay rent over that time period. So now that we've kind of understood a little bit how the employment situation changed, how the respondents were impacted by the financial situation and their ability to pay rent, I'd like now to invite Kevin Watson and Stephanie Smith to kind of comment on their experience through their organizations as it relates to these results.
Great, thanks, Katie. I'll make some initial comments, and then I think Stephanie's obviously some things to add as well. No, I mean, I think clearly we know how tough a year it's been, but I think it's really useful, in the Kingsley survey that you've done as part of Grace Hill to really assess what the impact is. And so I think seeing that 42% of respondents saying they had an impact on their income, and a quarter of those saying, that it was pretty severe. Yet seeing that actually 93% of respondents said that they felt able to pay their rent in full. And I think that's certainly what we experienced in the BTR sector in the UK, is that actually, as we've seen sort of published quite regularly, rent collection rates have been in the high 90s and pretty consistently throughout the last 18 months. So I think that's been fantastic to see. And I think some of that is also probably related to the fact that, as BTR operators, we've been pretty kind of proactive around going to residents when, everything started to happen, and speaking to them about their situation and being quite upfront with them, and having that dialogue around payment plans and other things. So I think, we can see that actually, maybe if you looked at the figures on the last but one slide, you might think that actually the impact would be much more significant on rents than actually what we've been seeing come through.
Thank you, Kevin. And I think actually, you've raised some really good points there, because what, as I was taking a look at some of the information over the past 18 months, obviously we're all glued to our desks, glued to spreadsheets, figuring out what was going to be happening. We did a lot of delving into demographics, and, Katie, thank you very much for covering sort of the broad base of residents that were really queried during this study. Obviously, this one was very heavily London-based, and we had that kind of upper 20s portion that was a regional type of basis for residents. And if we look at the London base, I know across, for instance, our portfolios, we're pretty evenly split between public and private sector. We have, about 10% where they're self-employed, and, there's kind of that small sliver of other. But, if you think about where we did tend to see the biggest hit for a lot of our residents were in those properties where they were close to airports, or where we had a large base of residents that were hospitality focused, and some other kind of more entertainment industry properties. And so I think it definitely follows the trends as far as what you would expect to see, whereas outside of London there tends to be a little bit bigger of a private sector basis. And I think that, as Kevin rightfully pointed out, via the remit survey, which UKAA heavily supports, we're seeing that in the beginning of the month it typically ranges kind of mid to high 80s for collections, but by the end of the month, really we're in the mid, sometimes very high 90s, especially as we're starting to come to the tail end and there's light at the end of the tunnel, which very much correlates with the numbers on the far right-hand side. And what we found was, as Kevin said, going to residents, finding out what their circumstances were, working with them on payment arrangements, something that was reasonable for them and that we could keep people in the properties was absolutely vital. And so I think, that also plays into some of the communication aspects and just making sure that we are working with our residents in every factor. A really nice benefit of having on-site teams who know the residents very well.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin and Stephanie. That's really helpful to have your perspective on what the reality on the ground was for both of your organizations. So next, what I would like to do is kind of take a look at the flip side of the coin. So how residents kind of experienced their management team's efforts as it related to COVID-19. So that's the next slide we're looking at here. I mentioned earlier that we would occasionally look at results broken out by those, renting from an institutional landlord or BTR and those renting from a private landlord. And so that's what we're looking at here. We did ask residents to rate their satisfaction with management across these 6 rating areas on a scale from 1 to 5. So 1 being poor, very dissatisfied, and 5 being excellent or very satisfied. And you're looking at the percent that said they were satisfied with each of these aspects of the management service in this particular category. The area where there's the biggest difference between these 2 groups, the institutional landlords and the private landlords, is just related to general service during COVID-19. So 73% of residents saying they were satisfied with this aspect versus 63% of those renting from a private landlord saying they were satisfied. Communication has been another really interesting rating area, and as Stephanie mentioned, communication was really vital throughout the pandemic. So overall, 68% of residents saying they were satisfied with communication during the pandemic, 72% of those renting from an institutional landlord versus 64% of those saying that they rented from a private landlord. And just to put a little bit of these results into perspective, we've asked some similar questions in the US. Some of these questions we asked last spring, some of these questions we've asked kind of throughout the year on our ongoing surveys. And so for this first one, general service, we asked this question last spring, and the satisfaction level here was 72% for US residents. So kind of right in line with the institutional landlord group from the UK. For communication, we have seen a little bit higher levels of satisfaction from US residents. So from Q1 of 2021, again, we're asking this question across our ongoing survey, so slightly different study format, but we've seen 84% satisfaction from that group as it relates to communication. And when you think about the US audience, it's probably most comparable to this group, to the institutional landlord group. But I've said quite a bit there. So again, if there's anything that Kevin or Stephanie, if you would like to add to your thoughts here.
The biggest thing that stands out to me here really is, as you said, that general service. And, I think what's important to keep in mind is that a lot of the respondents may have been single family homes or kind of in a block management scenario, and maybe not as close, where you have that closer relationship with your residents as maybe you do in build to rent or multifamily style apartment communities, where you tend to have more consistency in communicating with your residents, some additional programs that are in place, so very quick to respond and sort of stay ahead of the curve. And I think that, I know, for instance, with our teams, we actually saw this coming actually as it crossed from Asia into Europe and then into the UK and then obviously into the US. And so I think in some ways we were very lucky. I know that very early on, we had roundtable discussions across all of our property management teams, regardless which brand they may fly under, and just very much making sure that we were all on the same page, staying as much ahead of the curve as we could with getting comms out to the residents. So, if you think about that, whereas sometimes when you have somebody who maybe is in a single family home or in a block situation and several different property managers, it's harder to get consistent messaging across. The other aspect too is that if you think about it, when you walk into our buildings, you have that front desk person, you know them, you're probably more comfortable to talk to them because you see them on that ongoing basis, and maybe confide that, my husband's hours were cut, or, oh yeah, I work in theater, I work, in the entertainment industry, and therefore, obviously I can't, we're not putting on the shows and so therefore they're going to be impacted in that way, and they're a little more open to having those conversations. So and also just creating that sense of community and being able to implement some of the different programs. Like I know, for instance, on one of our earlier UKAA sessions, we had a highlight from the Gatefold, which Be Here manage on behalf of Invesco, and Akash, the property manager there, was out and he was doing outdoor people on the patio, dance party, exercise events, and things like that. So there was still that little bit of engagement while keeping an eye on well-being for the residents. So yeah, I think that we do have definite advantage in the build-to-rent industry. Sorry, Kevin, hopefully I didn't steal any thunder, but I'll turn over to you.
Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, look, I think I'd just like to echo a lot of the points that Stephanie's raised. And I think, one reflection is, you look at all the percentages on this slide and they're all very high, which is great to see that level of satisfaction in such a difficult period for all the residents in the various kind of different types of rental. But I think to see that difference between institutional BTR versus private renting, in this slide just kind of brings home the added value of build to rent. And as Stephanie says, with the on-site staff, the way that the communities are set up, and that actually you can reach out to everyone with a consistent approach. I'd also say around speed of action, right? We have people on site, we can make things happen very quickly, we can decide what to do and act, in a prompt way, which I think residents really appreciate. And actually, I think across the board here, you can see that generally BTR, is scoring much higher in terms of satisfaction. And I think that starts to underline the wider value proposition of why live in a build to rent building. And actually, even during the most challenging of times, actually that can be a real benefit for residents. And I think obviously we're going to go on to talk about, Katie, is then what does it mean if you are satisfied versus not, actually, and the impact that has on your overall experience.
Yeah, that was the perfect segue. So we are going to explore that over the next couple of slides. Thank you, Kevin. So no survey of residents would be complete without asking about the likelihood to recommend their community. It's a great way to measure, outcomes that benefit the manager and the landlord. We ask it on this NPS scale, so it stands for Net Promoter Score. And the questions asked from 0 to 10, how likely you are to recommend your community. So the question that's asked, or a way to frame this type of recommendation question across industries. And so what we're looking at here is kind of the breakdown, sneak peek for how do you interpret the results. We don't show these labels here on the survey. It's just 0 to 10. 0 is labeled definitely would not, and 10 is labeled definitely would. But if the resident or the survey respondent answers from 0 to 6, this would be across any industry, that they're considered a detractor. So they're actually negatively speaking about the brand or the product, kind of harming the brand. If they answer 7 to 8, they're considered passive. So even though these look like kind of high scores, and 8, they're still actually not doing that much in either direction, not harming, not hurting, or helping. And then if they rate their likelihood to recommend as a 9 or a 10, they're considered a promoter. So they're actively speaking positively about their experience and about the brand. And then the Net Promoter Score is simply the percent of promoters minus the percent of detractors. And so the range of scores here for this particular type of question is actually quite wide. It can be anywhere from plus 100 to negative 100. So you could have a situation where 100% of your customers are promoters. That would be the NPS of 100. Or flip side, 100%, a negative 100, 100% of your detractors or your customers are detractors. We don't typically see scores up at those ends of the extremes. They tend to be a little bit more in the middle. And for this particular study, NPS was a 6 across the overall resident base. But the more interesting thing here again is, what does NPS look like if you're satisfied with management's general service during COVID-19? So amongst those group that answered positively to that particular rating question, NPS was 38. The flip side of that, if the resident said they were dissatisfied with management's general service during COVID-19, the NPS was a negative 61. So a pretty wide gap here between these two groups. And so it really shows that when the on-site teams or the management firm is taking that extra effort to work with residents, to respond, to be supportive, it really does make a difference to what ultimately becomes the bottom line. Likelihood to recommend plays into, online reviews that are left about communities. We know that's important in the search process. So for those that are really working hard, they're also helping. When they're working hard to serve residents, they're also helping to improve the bottom line. So as Kevin mentioned, we're also going to take a look now at future plans to move. And so once again, we just wanted to ask very directly, are you planning to move in the next 6 months? And a little over half of residents said no, they weren't planning to move. 25% were unsure, and 22% said yes, they were planning to move in the next 6 months. And then again, looking at that same question, the satisfaction with general service during the pandemic, amongst those residents that are satisfied with this rating area, 19% said they're planning to move in the next 6 months, but 32% said they're planning to move if they are dissatisfied with general service during the pandemic. So again, a pretty big gap here between these two groups, 13 percentage point difference. So again, this comes into play with the bottom line. We can see a very direct impact on satisfaction with, again, this is just a very general aspect of management service. And then actually there's some more follow-up questions to be asked about this situation. So we asked, how's your intent to move changed in the last 6 months? And for most residents that hadn't, 88% said no. But 7% said, yes, they were previously planning on moving, but had decided not to. And then 6% said, yes, I was not previously planning on moving. So of this group here, the 13% of respondents, we asked them some follow-up questions about what caused their moving plans to change. And we're looking at the percent of responses for each of these categories. As we saw earlier, the 42% of respondents said the pandemic had a financial impact on them. So for 44% here to say a change in income influenced their decision, that's pretty much expected. But I'd like to point out that 24%, so nearly a quarter, did say that an experience of the community during the pandemic caused them to change their moving plans. And then this other group here, we looked at those verbatim comments. So they selected other, and then they had an opportunity to provide some qualitative responses. And of this other group here, 26% mentioned space requirements in some way. So either saying that they needed more space because of working from home, or they didn't need to be as close to their office now that they were working from home. So things along that line. Again, kind of expected given how the pandemic impacted daily life. And then lastly, last point here is just that 68% of those planning to move do expect to pay lower rent at their next apartment. So with that, again, I can imagine that Kevin and Stephanie have some really interesting perspectives on these results.
Thank you, Katie. It's interesting to see these numbers because if you think, 53% not planning to move, so that would indicate a fairly strong resident retention base, and naturally if somebody is dissatisfied, they're more likely, it's harder to save them in the long run. And sometimes it is a situation like this. I mean, obviously it was unforeseen, and we're not normally in pandemic situations, but it does speak volumes as to kind of that satisfaction number that you showed earlier on and how that factors into it. A couple interesting things as I was taking a look, we did have, depending on the asset, up to 4% of early terminations or assignments of leases due to economic adversity for some of our different residents. And on average, it was about 2%. But what we did to try to overcome this was very much, if we knew that somebody lost a roommate or that they needed to downsize, we tried to work with them. And that is a clear advantage of the build to rent industry, especially since so many of us still have lease up assets or some stock that we're able to move people into, offering that flexibility of going from the 2-bedroom down into the 1-bedroom, or if they need to add a roommate so they can afford the rent a little bit more, allowing them more space. Or we actually had plenty of residents, speaking to the point on space, who moved into a 2-bedroom because they actually wanted to have a home office, because as so many of us have been doing, working from home, trying to juggle and have 2 people working from a kitchen counter isn't necessarily feasible, which obviously very much plays into future design factors for the things that we'll be considering on some of our future properties. But I think to one of our assets, which we did an amenity renovation on through COVID, quite interestingly, and midpoint, we actually stepped back and redesigned portions of it to allow for more flexible workspaces, and also add a couple of different pockets throughout the community where people could still be socially distanced. We could manage individual bookings, things like that. So I think that was quite a unique situation that Invesco was able to learn from and consider as we move forward. And I know with Kevin's portfolio, obviously that was heavily stabilized. And whereas some of our other assets, we had the lease up properties that we had the first leases expiring during COVID at the same time that we were leasing up. And, we did see a little bit of a trail. Normally our turnover rate was, 35 to 40%. And actually we did see it spike up to about 44%. Especially towards the tail end as some of the leases were coming up and people were realizing the knock-on effect as companies were laying people off once some of the schemes were tapering to a degree, or there was uncertainty around those. But what I have seen, actually, I'm very pleased to say, is in this last quarter, our total move-outs they've actually dropped by 15% over the past 3 months. So that shows that we are actually seeing some of that light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, I'll just add a few points to that, specifically from a platform perspective. I mean, I think this slide is really interesting to see actually what the change in intention has been and why people are actually thinking about that. This obviously covers both build to rent and private landlord. But I think, as Stephanie said, we've seen kind of some of these kind of impacts be heightened in build to rent. I think particularly, people who are were planning to move now actually realizing some of the benefits of where they live. And I think, quite often it's the case that maybe those benefits are there, but you don't actually really appreciate them as much until you get to a situation like this. And actually, what we've seen is, people really appreciative of outside space, roof terraces that have remained open where people can socially distance and get outside, get some fresh air, enjoy kind of the surroundings. So walk their dog. We've seen pet ownership be a real trend throughout the pandemic, and I think that will continue. And I think realizing that actually your build to rent development, as all ours are at platform, are pet friendly has been a real positive coming through. And as Stephanie says, we've seen a large number of people working from home, and actually the ability to stay within the same building and the same community, but actually maybe go from a 1-bed to a 2-bed and have a home office is a unique opportunity to build to rent, which, if you're in private renting and private landlord, actually you're going to have to move completely to satisfy that demand. So I think, that's really good. And the final thing I'd say is, you've got that bar which is experience at community during the pandemic. And whilst we've looked at the previous slides around what management have done to deal with, the pandemic, actually what we've seen is that just, everyone coming together actually in a community themselves, not necessarily prompted by management at all, to actually show how they help each other out. And, at Platform, we've seen, we've facilitated obviously residents getting together, talking to each other, whether it's WhatsApp, Facebook groups, or whatever else it is. And actually, helping each other out, maybe when people are self-isolating, going to get their shopping, kind of helping with walking their dog, or whatever that may be, and actually really bonding and coming together. And I think that experience, at community during the pandemic bar really starts to highlight some of that, where people have gone, actually, being in a build to rent development, being surrounded by people that, are in the same situation as me, and actually that we can communicate with and get together with, even if some of that's virtual, has actually really come to the fore. So I think that's great. And then finally, the last point on the bottom right, which is the 68% seeking lower rent. Obviously, when this survey was done, is a couple of months ago, and it's interesting to see. I think we're starting to see rents really bounce back, and I think obviously we've seen a slightly different picture in London versus the rest of the country. So I think we might see a slightly different stat to that if we were to do the survey again now.
Yeah, thank you both. It's so great to hear how it's been experienced by the ownership and management perspective. Another aspect of both the prospective resident experience and the management perspective is, how do you tour when you have to socially distance? So virtual tours became a pretty common thing throughout the pandemic. It was kind of a new frontier prior to that. Not that many firms were doing it on any kind of intentional basis. So we asked very directly in the survey, had you toured an apartment virtually in the last year? And 40% of respondents said they had toured virtually. And then 45% of that group said that virtual tour that they had participated in was sufficient to make their decision to reserve their apartment. So it really kind of speaks to the effectiveness of this aspect of touring in terms of still getting leases signed and getting residents into buildings. And then we looked at that breakdown by age group. Typically, there's an assumption that younger age groups feel more comfortable with various aspects of technology and virtual tours. And so that's what we see here, that those in the younger age groups were more likely to have participated in a virtual tour, and especially amongst the under 25 age group, a much higher likelihood that tour was sufficient and to make their decision to lease the apartment. But even those in this last age group, 45 to 64, nearly a third had toured an apartment virtually, and about a third had said that tour was sufficient to reserve their apartment. There's a couple of different ways that virtual tours were taking place. So some were just kind of self-guided through online programs. Others were a phone video tour with a leasing agent themselves. Some prospective respondents or prospective residents participated in both forms of a tour. So that's what we're seeing here, the breakdown of the type of virtual tour that the respondent had participated in. And then we're looking at satisfaction, again, from 1 to 5. How satisfied were you with that tour you participated in? And so that's what we're looking at here, percent satisfied broken out by institutional landlord versus private landlord. So we are starting to get into kind of a smaller segment of the overall respondent pool here, but there are some pretty interesting differences between satisfaction with each of these tour types. The self-guided tour tends to have a little bit lower satisfaction compared to touring with a leasing agent. So again, this is what we also typically have seen in the US, that satisfaction is a bit higher when there's another person actually involved, even if it's not in person. If you're interacting with them over a video call, it still usually results in higher levels of satisfaction with that tour. And that's what we see here, especially with the institutional landlord, that BTR group, 74% satisfied when they did that video tour with a leasing consultant. And then finally, as a kind of final follow-up question after all these other questions, we did ask if the resident would be willing to rent their next apartment home without an in-person tour. So kind of future predictions here. And here it's a little bit lower, only 16%, so they would be willing to rent their next home without an in-person tour. Just for a little bit perspective, when we asked this question in May of 2020 amongst the US audience, that was 40%. That said they'd be willing to rent their next home without an in-person tour. But in May of 2020, we knew less about the COVID-19, how it was spreading. And so people's comfort level with continuing to remain physically distanced from each other was a lot different than it was by the time we were asking these questions in January and February of this past year. So again, I'd be curious to hear the perspectives from Kevin and Stephanie around virtual tours.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of points that I'll just raise here. One of them is, you've written, as you say, on the right-hand side, only 16% of respondents would be willing to rent without an in-person viewing. But actually, I think that's still quite a substantial percentage. I think we've gone for a while potentially where the assumption from potential renters was indeed you need an in-person viewing, and that's what you do, and that's how you rent property. I think, as you've said, that the number has fluctuated quite a bit. Reference 40% in the US, but that was kind of back in the early days of the pandemic in 2020. But from my perspective, I think that's really exciting. The technology is here. I think we've been using it really well in the UK and adapting very quickly to that. And actually, for some people, particularly depending on where they're moving from, potentially other parts of the country or more likely abroad, actually to be quite comfortable and there to be a really good process and technology in place to deliver an excellent virtual viewing that actually gives you everything you need remotely, I think is great. And 16% of respondents saying yes, I'd be quite happy for that to be the only viewing I do to rent a property, I think is really powerful. The other piece I'd say is in that middle graph there where you've got a virtual tour with a leasing consultant, great to see that for BTR that's 74% satisfied. I think our platform, as with most BTR operators, we do the viewings in-house, and the reason for doing that is to have someone who really knows the building, knows the community, knows the brand, to really kind of give you a sense of that when you do that tour, whether that's in person or indeed whether it's virtual. And I think it's great to see that translates into higher satisfaction for the person and the prospect that's doing that virtual tour on the other end. So I think that kind of reinforces, I guess, having the on-site staffing model, having those experts and having those be the ones that, are there in the community every day to actually explain what it's all about.
Absolutely, Kevin. I couldn't agree more. I think that, even though it says only 16, I think that that's actually tremendous. So obviously, I'm from the US. I grew up in the multifamily model. And I mean, I remember, if you think back even 15 years ago in the multifamily market, 20 years ago, most people couldn't even fathom just doing something virtually. And yes, there were times where perhaps I had somebody moving from California into Colorado and I could do a virtual tour and I would walk them through on the website and to all of that. And it came down to really building that trust, which clearly, if you look at that 74%, in the center, that speaks volumes as to the way that we're able to actually explain and sell the community, and not just the community, but the services and the meaning of what build to rent and institutional investments can offer, and also that security of the stay on the property. And, if you think how long it took for the US market to actually reach the numbers that they're now hitting as far as that satisfaction and the comfort with renting via virtual tours, I feel like the way that the technology industries and our teams have stepped up and actually catapulted this acceptance, is just absolutely tremendous. I can't say enough about our teams that have been on site and, working through very tough circumstances, but still able to extol the virtues of, we're going to be here to take care of you. And I think that that's just absolutely tremendous number there. And also the numbers on the other side, as far as the age ranges and the comfort levels, it does show that technology, by using different formats of technology, whether that's in person, whether that's a virtual tour via, Matterport or whoever, you're actually able to reach multiple groups of people and find comfortable levels for each of them to interact with you. So I think that this is just showing a tremendous nod to the technology advances that were really forced upon us.
Yeah, thank you. And that's why it's always so great to have perspectives on the results from those in the industry practicing these things, in real time, to shed light and put the results into the bigger picture. So we do appreciate those viewpoints you've offered. The last kind of item that we'll cover today is just the other aspects of how resident life was impacted. And so you might think we've already asked residents up to this point quite a few questions, but we weren't quite done yet. So we do have a number of other data points to discuss on this slide, because the pandemic did impact everyone in so many different ways. So one of the questions we asked was just who is working from home. So keep in mind that responses to a lot of these questions are based on 56%. So over half of residents saying everyone was working from home, another 26% saying a portion was working from home. So, well over 80% had people in their household in the apartment, in the home most of the time. And so 42% of respondents said they were utilizing grocery delivery services. 53% of respondents said they were ordering more takeaway than usual than compared to prior to the pandemic. 31% said that the package delivery had been disrupted at their community since the start of the pandemic. And 77% said social distancing impacted the way that they remained physically active, with actually 40% of this group saying that they stopped being physically active. And then another 38% saying that they started exercising inside. So it really impacted how we really did every aspect of our life, whether it was eating, receiving goods and services, and staying active. So I know that's a lot of different data points on here to kind of consume and digest. So I'm curious to hear from Kevin and Stephanie, which of these kind of stick out to you the most, and how you might think it would impact the future of renting.
Katie, I think there are a couple here that stick out to me. Biggest one is the impact on the physical activity. We recognized very early on that people were going to be stuck in their homes, sometimes in limited spaces. And, not everybody necessarily had outside space. Most of our properties do have balconies, things like that they could access, but maybe not necessarily sizable enough to have a full-on fitness routine. So that was where it was really important to us to implement some wellness programs, have online virtual fitness classes, and also mental health support through trusted partners that we were working with. So it went beyond just kind of recognizing the need for physical activity. It was also that mental engagement, and as Kevin rightfully pointed out, some of the different activities and getting residents linked up via social media or WhatsApp groups or whatever the case may be. So I can absolutely see that. And that's what also has led us on one of our future properties to look at not just kind of gym space, but also having additional flex space that you could use as a wellness room. You could have it as a yoga studio, things like that, which obviously, is something that's been in the market for a long time and we've done on other properties, but we've amplified that a little bit more. And then the other piece to this that really sticks out to me naturally are the packages. I mean, let's be honest, any one of us at any given moment had, Amazon knocking on our door. And what we've done, whether residential or with our student housing, is taking a look at it and saying, look, we know that some properties maybe didn't have as much storage, so maybe we didn't have parcel lockers put in. But actually, by working with our parcel locker companies and having those conversations and thinking how we can be creative with that. You've seen some of the established companies who maybe only had indoor package services. They're now offering more robust services where you can actually have, the locker bays outside and they're protected. And likewise, we're also working with one of the companies for the grocery delivery service, having refrigerator boxes that are tacked on to some of the existing parcel locker configurations. So those are two that really spoke to me as I saw this, and it just reinforced even more that we were heading down that correct path, that we were already getting feedback from our own personal Kingsley surveys amongst our residents.
And Stephanie, I'll build on that by looking at the other one, which is around ordering takeout. I mean, to see that percentage, 53% of respondents saying they're not just having takeout, but having takeout more than usual, is a phenomenal percentage. And it doesn't surprise me in some respects, but clearly has some quite significant implications for how we design and operate our buildings. Seeing the amount of delivery riders that arrive every day and every night at particularly large scale BTR sites, and being able to make sure that you're managing access to control to the building, lifts, space to park mopeds outside, etc., 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 was already a big challenge and is clearly becoming even more of a challenge. And similar to what Stephanie was saying on parcels, plays into the same thing. So parcels, takeout, all sorts of deliveries. You can see there the grocery delivery service as well. So I think, real implications, but also real sort of positive opportunities to actually, talk about build to rent. It's about building a building that actually is designed to cope with this and to actually do this very efficiently for residents, for staff on site, and indeed for those doing the delivery. And actually, if it works well, it really makes your life easier. So I think it's really interesting stats on the slide.
And actually, Kevin, to your point, it's kind of interesting if you look at the correlation. So 56% are working from home, 53% are ordering more takeout than usual, which actually really but very much speaks to maybe some of those extended hours as we're finding it harder to unplug because our living room, our kitchen, whatever, is both our home space and our workspace. So you get caught up in those hours and that Deliveroo or Uber Eats is looking far and far more attractive.
It's so interesting to hear you speak about what you were already starting to do, and these results just kind of reinforced the need to be aware of these different aspects of resident life and resident behavior and how it impacts the design of the building and how the on-site management teams kind of respond to these needs. And so I guess any final thoughts from Stephanie or Kevin before we start to wrap up here?
The point I was going to make is you're going to do a bit of a summary, I think, Katie, but also clearly the report is available to download as well, because I think there's so many great stats in here, guys, and you'll get a link towards the end. But obviously some of them, or a lot of them, we've shown today and talked about. But I think just it's a great sort of temperature check for the BTR sector and BTR versus private rent in the UK. So I think that's something I think Katie is really useful. But then people to go download the report and really have a read through themselves and sort of engage in what it means for us as a sector.
Absolutely. And I think it just extols that even more, that we definitely, how valuable our resident feedback is. We're here, we are a service industry. We are here to take care of people in their homes, and, we build value by doing that. And, I think that what this report also shows is that, you can have all the best amenities in the world, but without our staff, without our on-site teams who are really putting in that grunt work every single day, it really just means, it doesn't mean as much if you don't have really just stellar teams to take care of your residents. So I think that the feedback was excellent, and I think it just speaks to volumes as to our team's capabilities. So thanks so much to Kingsley and Grace Hill for hosting this. I think this is just fantastic.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives on all of these results. It's so helpful to see and hear directly how the results help you all understand the own experience that you've had throughout this pandemic. And just to recap some of the high-level findings here, 42% of respondents said that the pandemic had impacted them financially. So quite a few, nearly half of renters, 68% on the more positive end here, 68% said they're satisfied with their management team's kind of general service during the pandemic. So despite having that economic hardship as a result of the pandemic, management teams really came through for the residents. 22% of residents are planning to move in the next 6 months, but as we can see, there's ways that management can kind of intervene and reach out to residents. Stephanie mentioned if they need to move for more different floor plan or space, there's opportunities to offer them something else within the same building, and then most people are very likely still kind of working from home. And so how does that impact their lifestyle? What can management do to kind of help better meet some of those needs, as it relates to receiving groceries, receiving takeaway orders, and also just remaining physically active. So as mentioned, there is a brief report here available for download for free. I believe the link might be shared here in the chat, so you can just go to the Grace Hill page there and download it.
I'd just like to say thank you to everyone who's taken part, Katie, John, Melissa, Stephanie, and Kevin. Thank you everyone for joining us, but equally thank you all the companies who participated in this, the first national renters survey. I believe we had 12 or 1,800 respondents from 12 companies, I think, Katie. I might be wrong, but look, what we'd really like to do is we would clearly want to repeat this, because what we already saw was that two things. One was that there's lots of really interesting data in there. Secondly, that the world has moved on since we took this survey, so let's take the opportunity to do it again. We need to work out how frequently to do this, but there's clearly a hunger and a need for information from our residents, and the ability to take a temperature check across the sector is really, really important. A couple of minor comments from me on content. I thought when we saw about 53% of residents increasing their 58% of people increasing the amount of takeaway they bring in. Oh dear, my English is terrible this afternoon. I thought, what about the opportunities for dark kitchens? There's at least a couple of UKAA members doing that sort of idea, and those think may present some really interesting opportunities. But the ability to configure the way we create our buildings in response to what's happening outside is a really important one. Anyway, I'll finish on that point just to mention a few other things that are happening in the UKAA events calendar. Next week on the 29th, we've got tenant retention through technology presented by Moricon Consultancy. We've then got a workshop on the 1st of July, Youth Homelessness, the BTR sector's role to play in tackling a post-pandemic crisis. That's an invitation-only workshop being hosted by our friends at Land Aid, which will be a really important event. We've got a reverse trade show on the 13th of July and forums throughout July. But before then, tomorrow, you'll all be receiving a note in the email from us inviting you to contribute to and hopefully donate some money to the UKAA Best Practice Guide. We've got a lot of people working on that already. That's a major project for us. It will take the sector forward significantly when we produce it. A lot of you have been working it already, and we really look forward to people carrying on working on that and contributing more. So do join us for the UKAA Best Practice Guide. Things will be coming out tomorrow. I do notice, however, we do have one note in the Q&A. Let's see what we've got there. how did you randomly select private landlords? Well, the answer is we didn't select the private landlords. What we selected were UKAA members who also service buy-to-let environment. And I think that's really important. The common factor throughout all of this was professional management, but professional management, block managers working with private landlords as well as with build-to-rent sectors. So, the build-to-rent sector. I hope that gives you an answer. But anyway, thank you once again for joining us, and look forward to talking to you all again soon. Thank you. Thanks, John, everybody. Thank you.